Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in to Reed Smith's Labor and Employment Real-Time Chat Series. I'm Emily Harbison, a partner in our Houston office, and I'm joined by Mark Goldstein, a partner in our New York office, and Amanda Brown, a senior associate in our Dallas office. Today, we will be talking about the OSHA Emergency Temporary Standard, or OSHA ETS, on vaccination and testing that was issued late last week. We know nearly everyone was anxiously awaiting the ETS after President Biden announced his path out of the pandemic plan in early September, which directed OSHA to issue the ETS. Well, now the ETS is here, and it sets some fairly short timeframes for compliance, especially when taking into account we're about to head into the holiday season. And since it's nearly 500 pages long, during this chat, we'll take you through what you need to know. So with that, Amanda, can you give us a very high-level overview of what the ETS requires?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Emily. And I know, as you said, it's been eagerly anticipated for some time, ever since it was announced early September. So there's a lot to dive into. We're going to keep it very high level, and we'll get into the details in follow-up series. But to start with, I mean, as anticipated, it is going to be a vaccination or testing requirement. So what that means is that employers have to put in place a policy that either requires that all of their employees be vaccinated, or they can have a policies that says employees must be vaccinated, or if not vaccinated, have to submit to weekly testing. So the deadlines to comply with those overarching requirements are twofold, right? We have a December 5th deadline by which employees have to comply with some additional requirements of not only having their policy in place, but they also have to have in place procedures for, reporting positive test results and removing positive employees from the workplace, and then also requiring unvaccinated employees to wear a mask at the workplace. And then starting January 4th, that's when employees have to start complying with the weekly testing and fully vaccinated requirements. So that's the high level overview. There's a lot more to unpack with the ETS, but we'll get into those details in the next series.
And Amanda, it applies only to employers with 100 or more employees, right?
Right, that's right, Emily. And it's certainly another whole area we could get into and how to count those 100. But I do think it's important to note that for purposes of counting, you have to include your temporary workers, you have to include your remote workers, you don't have to include independent contractors, but it's also counted at a company-wide level. So if you think there's a feasible way that you're getting to 100, most likely you're within the scope of this ETS.
Got it. That makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so now to you, Mark. What does the written policy that Amanda referenced need to have in it? And what if a company has already had a vaccine or testing policy in place already?
Sure. So glad to be here. Be participating with both of you. So essentially, the OSHA ETS is all about companies with 100 or more employees, as you mentioned, adopting a specific written policy. And actually, the ETS gives employers two options, although OSHA expresses a very clear preference that you adopt the first option, which is a mandatory vaccination policy, and essentially is a policy that requires all employees with 100 or more, of entities with 100 or more U.S. employees to become fully vaccinated against COVID-19. The OSHA ETS does include a carve-out acknowledging that employees wouldn't be subject to a mandatory vaccination policy if they're individuals for whom a vaccine is medically contraindicated, if they're individuals for whom medical necessity requires a delay in vaccination, or where they're legally entitled to reasonable accommodation under federal anti-discrimination law, such as under Title VII or the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, that's the primary policy that the ETS focuses on. And again, that's what OSHA wants most employers to adopt. They say that throughout the document, but they do technically give another option. That other option is for employers to adopt a written policy, again, that essentially allows employees to choose between becoming fully vaccinated and submitting to weekly COVID testing. So you have the option to pick whichever policy you want. And if you pick the latter option, employees will have the option to choose between becoming fully vaccinated and submitting to weekly COVID testing. Although I think Amanda's going to talk about in a little bit what that weekly COVID testing looks like. It is a bit arduous for employees. So there really is much more of an incentive for businesses and employees to go with the fully vaccinated option. Now, for employers who have already adopted mandatory vaccination policies or the alternate policy prior to this, either under a state or local mandate or just as a matter in the regular course of business, you can keep those policies so long as they fully align with the ETS. Having said that, OSHA on its website has also published model policies that employers can use. So it may make sense to, at a minimum, compare and contrast your existing policy to OSHA's model to make sure you've got everything that OSHA thinks is important. And it may even make sense to consider adopting OSHA's policy so that you ensure that you're in compliance with the ETS. If you're using the OSHA model, presumably OSHA's not going to challenge the legitimacy of that policy.
Got it. That makes sense. So you mentioned that employees may have to test. What types of, or if they're not vaccinated, so in order to prove that an employee is fully vaccinated, what type of documentation or proof can a company accept from their employees?
Sure. So every covered employer under the ETS has an affirmative obligation to determine the vaccination status of each and every one of their employees. That includes employees who may be entitled to a reasonable accommodation from a mandatory vaccination policy. You have to affirmatively determine the vaccination status of each employee. So the documentation that you can use under the ETS, it's very clear what does constitute acceptable proof of vaccination status. Now, I think for probably 99.9% of employees, that's simply going to be a copy of their vaccination record card. There are other documentation that the ETS says is permissible, such as record of immunization from a healthcare provider or pharmacy, a copy of other medical records documenting the vaccination. But I think the vaccination card is going to be the primary one. What is interesting is that the ETS states that if an employee, let's say they've lost or is otherwise unable to provide proof of vaccination, there is a mechanism for them to still be considered fully vaccinated, and that's that the employee would have to sign and date a detailed attestation that basically says, I'm fully vaccinated, I've lost, or I'm otherwise unable to provide proof of vaccination, and includes certain other key language. If the employee is able to do that and able to submit that attestation, then the employee would be considered fully vaccinated, just as if they had submitted a vaccination card or other acceptable form of proof. If an employee is not able to submit the vaccination card or the attestation or other acceptable form of proof, the employer has to treat them as if they're not fully vaccinated. And then finally, what's important is to note that consistent with the EEOC's position from some of their FAQs earlier this year, the ETS makes clear that any vaccination status records or information are to be treated as confidential medical information and shouldn't be disclosed except as required by law, and should be maintained completely as confidential. And the one thing I think is also important to know, because this is going to come up for a lot of businesses, we talked before about who have mandatory vaccination or some other policy in place prior to the ETS. What if you've already checked for an employee's proof of vaccination? Do you have to do it again? And the ETS, and this of course makes sense, says that if you've already secured proof of vaccination from your employees, so long as it's one of those acceptable forms of proof, which again is probably just going to be the vaccination card, then you don't have to do it again, so long as you've got that affirmative record.
Got it. That's helpful. And Mark, just kind of to catch you off guard here a little bit, what if an employer has already looked at an employee's vaccination card but didn't retain a copy and just kind of put a check mark by their name? Do they need to go back and make a copy of that vaccination card or other acceptable documentation at this point?
I think that there's a little bit of ambiguity in the ETS on this point, but I think the best practice would be to do that. I understand that there may be an administrative burden of doing that, but to ensure compliance with the ETS, and to ensure that you've got that affirmative record rather than just the check saying we've seen it. I think so that you don't have any question about compliance, you would want to go back and get a copy of that record.
Yep, that makes sense. Okay. And Amanda, over to you for our last question. What kind of testing is acceptable under the ETS for those employees who are unvaccinated?
So the good news is the ETS provides very specific guidance on what testing is permitted, and it's kind of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it allows for employees to use rapid tests, but on the other hand, there's some restrictions on if they decide to do that. So under the ETS, there's 3 requirements for the testing. It has to be a test that's EUA authorized. It has to be a test that's administered according to the testing instructions, and it has to be the administration of the test has to be overseen either by the employer or a healthcare professional. And that third requirement is really interesting, right? Because some people or some companies so far with testing requirements have let their employees do at-home rapid tests. And under the ETS, that would not be acceptable because that test is not being overseen by either the employer or the healthcare provider. So when employees or employers are thinking about their options and they decide they're evaluating whether to go if they want to do a hard vaccination requirement or allow for the testing option, it's important to note that testing is going to require the employer to have their employees have a test that's overseen either by the company or by a healthcare professional, and thinking through what that looks like. Does that require the employer now to have a vendor come on site and oversee the testing when they're administered? Or how exactly logistically a company wants to satisfy those testing requirements? It's also really important to note too that if you have an employee who's tested positive, they don't have to go through the weekly testing requirement for 90 days after they've tested positive. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out too with employees who have tested positive. And before we wrap up, Emily, I mean, something important that we were supposed to note at the beginning, which is my fault, is that the ETS is currently stayed by the Fifth Circuit. So we received the ETS on Friday, November 5th, and then Saturday, November 6th, the Fifth Circuit issued a stay. And so that's not necessarily dispositive of what's going to happen with the ETS, and we would certainly recommend that employers continue to take action to plan to comply with the ETS. What will happen now is the Fifth Circuit's going to get response briefing from the DOL today, and then there'll be an opportunity for a reply from the states that are challenging or the companies that are challenging in the Fifth Circuit. But ultimately, lawsuits have now been filed challenging the ETS in the 5th, 6th, 8th, and 11th circuits. Right, so we've got 4 different circuits now, and what happens, and there could be potentially more, is there'll be a pool of those circuits, and it will be randomly selected which circuit is going to hear the challenge, right? So, say the 11th circuit gets that challenge, they're the ones selected. The 11th circuit could remove the stay from the Fifth Circuit. So, it's very much still up in the air about what's going to happen with enforcement of the ETS. But we do want to note that it is subject to legal challenge, but we certainly don't recommend that employers delay taking action to comply with ETS at this time.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, especially since the deadlines, as you mentioned earlier on, are so tight. You'll get yourself in a pickle if you wait too late waiting for this to work its way through the court challenges. So with that, Mark and Amanda, thank you so much for all this great practical information. Certainly lots to unpack here. There's certainly more than what we could cover during this quick chat. Topics like medical and religious accommodations and how to vet those and how to respond to them, record keeping requirements under the ETS that Mark referenced, legal challenges in more detail that Amanda teed up. We hope everyone will tune into future installments of the chat series where we will hopefully cover these topics in more detail. But with that, thanks again, Mark and Amanda, and thank you all for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.